Major General Winski, welcome to Signature Required.
Thanks. Good morning.
We are really excited to have you today. You are a historian. You are a servant to our nation. You are a retired two-star general who served 37 years in the U.S. Army, commanding formations at every level. Your career includes multiple combat deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other regions. In retirement, you are focused on honoring military history through your work with the Wings of Liberty Museum Project in Clarksville, Tennessee. You and your wife, Kimberly, are proud parents of 2 U.S. Army officers. We have done some research on you, and you're up to a pretty big project out there at Fort Campbell. And so we have 5 things that are jumping off points for our conversation. We'll probably get to all 5, but let me read these 5 things in, and then you get to start explaining the project that you're up to and start it from off one of these 5. Number 1, the Wings of Liberty Museum will celebrate the history of units like the 101st Airborne Division and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Number 2, the museum is a $40 million initiative with state and local grants, plus ongoing fundraising efforts. Number 3, the museum is expected to draw around 750,000 visitors annually, including veterans and Fort Campbell soldiers. Number 4, the building, now under construction, will be 40,000 total square feet with a 9,000 square foot atrium for public events, education, and military ceremonies. And number 5, admission to the museum will always be free, ensuring broad public access.
Yeah. Wow.
Those are 5 great waypoints to have a great discussion about.
We're going to have a blast.
Yeah.
So what are you up to? $40 million project. You're building something big out there.
Yeah, it's a significant museum. And it exists, and we're building it to honor the history and legacy of the great units that call Fort Campbell home. The 101st Airborne Division, you mentioned, the 5th Special Forces Group, which is called Fort Campbell home since the early 1980s, and then the 160th, which grew out of the 101st in the early 1980s as well. They call Fort Campbell home. So we want to honor the history and legacy of those 3 units. For those that don't know too much about Fort Campbell, it's only about 50 miles northwest of Nashville, right on I-24, home to about 26,000 soldiers in those 3 units and some other units and activities on post, about 45,000 family members there as well. So Fort Campbell itself, in terms of a city, is in the top few from all of Tennessee. Very significant population. Again, those great units call Fort Campbell home and have for a lot of decades, and it's long overdue to have a great museum that's easily accessible to the public that honors the history and legacy of those units. There's a great museum on post now, but it was built in the early 1960s. It was sufficient for that era when there wasn't a whole lot of history. It was clear since Desert Storm that we needed to really expand that, and that's when the foundation was formed and the efforts to raise the funds to build this museum began. About the resources and where we're at with construction, we started the build in June. The foundation's laid. The walls are getting prepped right now. We'll have the walls up by Thanksgiving. We'll have the roof on it by December, and then we'll really bring it to life as we install the artifacts and the exhibits and everything that's going to be the heart of the museum. So the building will be done late summer next year. We're going to hand it off to the Army. The Army will put its artifacts in there, and then by the end of the year next year, it'll be open to the public.
Wow. Fort Campbell, for those that are in Middle Tennessee, we know and love Fort Campbell. Right. It is a fixture of our state, but you spent a second describing Fort Campbell for those that are less familiar. So maybe do a little bit more about those that maybe don't have a military background at all, of understanding what Fort Campbell is, what it's serviced, what its purpose for, and just give us a good overview.
Yeah, great point. So Fort Campbell was built in World War II. It was a big training facility for all the forces that fought in Europe. After World War II, there was a significant downsizing of the Army. So the 101st fought in World War II, but deactivated and reactivated in the late 1950s at Fort Campbell. And that's when it was determined that Fort Campbell was going to become one of the long, enduring main installations that housed significant units like the 101st and the other units that call Fort Campbell home. So a lot of improvement over the decades. It's one of the sizable Army installations. Fort Liberty in North Carolina is the biggest in terms of population. Fort Cavazos in Texas, the biggest in terms of land mass. And then we're the 3rd largest in both of those. It's a substantial installation with significant units on it, but not too big that where you get gobbled up by it. Tens of thousands of acres constitute the training area. It really goes from Clarksville all the way out to the periphery of land between the lakes to the west there. And again, it's home to about 26,000 soldiers, and the main units are the 101st and 5th Special Forces and the 160th Special Ops Aviation Regiment.
Okay, so you're saying these numbers rather quickly. Can you give us a little bit more detail about who is there in these different regiments and what their specialties are? Sure.
So I'll start with the biggest unit, the 101st. That's this icon here. If you've seen The Longest Day, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, those movies and that miniseries chronicled the history of the 101st in World War II. That's when the division was born, and it was really a result of the advent between World War I and World War II, the advent and development of the airplane. Mm-hmm. It soon became apparent that we'd want the capability to drop soldiers behind enemy lines, to bypass their fortifications, bypass where they have their main defensives positions, and drop soldiers at points of vulnerability behind the lines, which is the 101st forte in World War II. So the 101st was formed and then trained like you saw in Band of Brothers, all across Georgia, the southeast United States. It deployed to England, and then its first major combat action was World War II, where the 101st spearheaded the invasion in Normandy on D-Day, and then was central to the second major campaign, which was September of 1944. If you saw the movie A Bridge Too Far, the jumps to seize all the bridges that would ultimately lead the Allied forces into Germany. That was the 101st second major campaign. And then the third major campaign, if you're familiar with the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, which was the Germans' last thrust to try to get forces to Antwerp to ultimately get a position of advantage there and kind of force the Allies to the table to sue for peace. There was a key town called Bastogne where 7 highways intersected, and the Germans had to have it to keep the momentum of their offense, and the Allies needed to retain it to slow the Germans down, get the defenses coherent again, and ultimately push them back to the east. And the 101st was licking its wounds from Holland and Normandy, accepting new replacement soldiers, etc. But the high command knew immediately that mission was so critical that the 101st was given the task of going in there, establishing a perimeter around that town, cutting all those lines of communication and roads, knowing that they were going to be surrounded by up to 20 times the force that was defending the town. And they fought bitterly in really tough winter conditions. And that battle probably showcases the tenacity and grit of the Screaming Eagle soldier better than anyone I know. So that's the 101st history in World War II. The Korean War, one of the units that's now part of the 101st, the 187 Infantry, they were central to a lot of actions in the Korean War. They made a couple of combat jumps there and fought for the 3 years of that war. The 101st was reactivated in the late 1950s. Again, that's when it first started calling Fort Campbell home. And then through the Cold War, Vietnam, the importance of stopping communism and the spread of communism in Vietnam in the 1960s resulted in the deployment of U.S. soldiers, U.S. forces, and the 101st was one of the first major units to deploy to Vietnam. It served in Vietnam from 1965, the entire division, 1967, all the way to the end in 1972 when it came back to Fort Campbell. And really the big change for the 101st in World War II to Vietnam was they kind of, with the advent of the helicopter, traded in parachutes for the lift helicopter, where they were able to do the same thing, overfly enemy defenses, strike points of vulnerability in their rear areas, but do it via helicopter assault. And that was perfected through the 70s and 80s and really put the test in Desert Storm. And that's when I first joined the 101st. My very first assignment was at Fort Campbell starting in late 1989. And within the first year there, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, as we recall, and we deployed immediately to protect Saudi Arabia and ultimately to eject him from Kuwait. So what we did there was further perfected and put to test again in the invasion of Iraq, and then all the campaigns in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and other areas since 2001 are things that we want to highlight in this museum. So that's kind of the history of the 101st. Now, 5th Special Forces Group is a critical unit. That if anybody was a Green Beret in Vietnam, they were in 5th Special Forces Group. Okay. 5th Special Forces Group formed at Fort Bragg, deployed to Vietnam, and then was the Special Forces group in Vietnam for the duration of the conflict in the early 1960s until the early 1970s. And then following Vietnam, they redeployed to Fort Bragg. And then in the early 80s, it was determined that 5th Special Forces Group was going to focus on the Middle East. And then they moved here to Fort Campbell, and they've been at Fort Campbell since then, aside from when they've been deployed. The 160th Special Ops Aviation Regiment, the 3rd unit we're honoring in this museum, is, as the name implies, a Special Ops Aviation Regiment. They specially selected, specially trained air crews, specially configured and designed aircraft. This was all born of the Iran hostage crisis. And if you recall, 1979, early 1980, there was an attempt to rescue them, Eagle Claw, Desert One, which failed. And it was in large part because of a host of factors, but there was no dedicated special ops aviation element available to support that kind of mission. So the 160th grew out of the 101st, and its first major combat action was Grenada, and it fought in Panama, and of course every chapter in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a host of unnamed operations that they're central to, that from their formation to today are the hallmark of what they do. So 3 great units, 3 great histories. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have served in these units over the years, over the decades, and we really want to build this museum to honor the history and inspire everybody that visits from these incredible stories. So
I heard you say your very first base was Fort Campbell. Where are you from originally?
Wisconsin is where I grew up, and came in the Army and trained down in Georgia. So that was my first duty station, but only for about 8 months or so. And then Fort Campbell was really my first assignment, and it was it just really impacted me. I think every success I've enjoyed since has been a result of those who trained me and got me ready to be a platoon leader in Desert Storm, and then the non-commissioned officers and the soldiers in my platoon helped in my development, and it was just an incredible experience. And I knew after that first tour I wanted to stay in long term, and I knew I wanted to serve at Fort Campbell as often and as long as I could have. And over my 30 plus years over really 15 years of that, we're at Fort Campbell. My service there spans 5 decades, late 1980s through the 2021 timeframe. So I've called it home. It's where my kids grew up. It's where they went to school. They were part of that community. It's an awesome part of the country. Tennessee is an awesome state to live in. At Fort Campbell, all that you love about Nashville is 50 miles to the east, and you got land between the lakes 50 miles to the west if you like hiking and watching eagles fly and fishing and all that kind of stuff. So it's just been hands down our favorite place to be stationed at, and that's what drew me back to this project and leading this effort because it's been such a big part of mine and my family's life.
Now, did you come from a military family? Was this something you always knew you wanted to do?
I knew early on I wanted to serve in uniform. My grandfathers were in the Army. My father was in the Navy. My uncle was in the Marine Corps. My mom was in the Air Force National Guard. So we got everything covered minus Space Force. But I was I missed
incredible.
That one by a couple of years. But I just knew from playing Army as a little kid that I was drawn to it. I knew I wanted to serve in the forces which protect our country and our way of life and be surrounded by folks who make that same commitment. That's what's really special about serving in uniform. And every assignment that I had was awesome. So I just decided to stay in for the long term and made it a lifetime career.
Well, and Spence and I have so much military in our family. I've got a cousin that's a Ranger. I have one that's flying helicopters in the Navy. Spence could go on and on too. Is your wife also from a military background?
So her dad fought in the Korean War, and my wife's been an Army nurse, a Department of the Army civilian nurse, works in the military hospitals where we've been stationed. So, and she's labor and delivery and women's health. She's delivered thousands of Army babies at Fort Campbell, at Fort Bragg, at Fort Hood, and all the places we've been stationed. So, that's awesome. And our children are in the military as well, as you'd mentioned. Our daughter and her husband are both helicopter pilots at Fort Campbell. And our son just left the Rangers. He's at Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, now for his second assignment.
Wow.
It's so fun to get to listen to a true historian talk through your total command of the facts and the story and the narrative. And I can also appreciate that for someone that has lived it, to have to take it to a increasingly large audience that knows very little about military history.
Right.
How do you approach that on a daily basis? Because you could think about the objective of the museum to say, we are going to give the most thorough, in-depth explanation, and I could understand the mission behind that. Or you could say, we're going to try to tell something that is much more accessible and is more entry level.
Yeah.
So how do you wrestle those two things?
Great point. Yeah, we want to inspire. So with regard to the museum, we want to inspire everybody who visits. And the best way to do that is through the stories of the soldiers that served in these units. And that's what we are really working on. Once we've complete the physical construction of the museum, the resources we have left and the resources and fundraising is perpetual in this kind of endeavor. But we want to really get interactives and add tech to everything. So if a group of kids is looking at the display on D-Day as an example, which is a Sherman tank coming ashore and paratroopers from the 101st that jumped in the night before, guiding them into position to close with and destroy the Nazis defending that area kind of thing. We want any visitor, but especially kids, young people, to take that in and then have a mechanism to delve into specific aspects of what they're seeing and, steer them towards whatever really inspires them or really interests them, whether that's the specific actions of some of the soldiers that are reflected in the diorama, whether it's the vehicle that they're looking at or the weapons that they're looking at. Tell me more about the M1 Garand and how many were made during World War II. Where were they made? Oh, that was in my hometown. Tell me more about this soldier and his family. And, things like the helmet here that I brought as a piece of decor in my office. Whose helmet would that have been? It's a lieutenant colonel icon. It's a third of the 506 icon, and it's got the vertical stripe on the back of a leader. So that would be Lieutenant Colonel William Wolverton, Bull Wolverton, who was killed, sadly, before his feet touched free French soil, but led and trained that battalion during its train-up and trained them so well that in spite of the loss of the leader, they still performed incredibly well. So that sort of thing. The accessibility you mentioned is key too. That's another big difference between the current museum, which is in the heart of Fort Campbell, right in the middle of it.
On base.
On base, built when it was relatively easy to get on base for everybody. Since 9/11, the security restrictions, et cetera, it's intimidating for someone who's not familiar to try to get on base. And I know it detracts or prevents folks who otherwise would be interested in visiting the current museum from doing so. So our footprint is going to be on the periphery of Fort Campbell. If you're familiar, it's where Highway 41A intersects Tiny Town Road. So right in the middle of Post, and we have it right on the periphery in a 35-acre campus that has its own gate. So people will be able to just drive into that footprint, into the museum parking lot, hop out of their car and go take in the museum and all that it offers. And it's always going to be free to the public, free to educators that want to explore archives and operational records or students that are doing deep research on stuff. Again, it's a resource, not just for Clarksville, Montgomery County, Middle Tennessee, but the nation. Anybody who's interested in those units, this will be the place to come learn about their history.
And help us understand the capacity in which you're doing this. Is this something that you've been commissioned to do by the Army?
Yeah.
Is this something that the state is having you do? Are you doing this as a private citizen?
Yeah, we're doing it as a foundation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. The foundation was formed to really gather the resources, the fundraising, and then get a design to build this museum. Again, it's been underway for a lot of years, and the history of it is really the cost of things have outpaced the fundraising. There's been some grants in the past that allowed the previous foundation leadership to buy a lot of exhibits and the guts of the museum. But think of it like this: we're now building a house, and we bought the furniture for it 20 years ago. It's not going to fit right in there,
It's a great analogy.
And some stuff's going to have to get, and there's been a lot of history made since then as well. Sure. So that's another one of our endeavors. But as a foundation, our main purpose is to build this this museum to educate, honor, inspire. But we also have objectives in terms of long-term education programs. We have a education committee that's kind of building steam as we speak, and we've had a couple of guest lecture series, hosting one down at Austin P right in Clarksville, and the second we just did on 9/11 here in the Vanderbilt campus, where we had Night Stalker 160th Special Ops pilots that flew in the Horse Soldier Green Berets of 5th Special Forces Group into northern Afghanistan right on the heels of the attacks on our nation 23 years ago. What a incredible, poignant way to reflect on the attacks on our nation and everything that's happened since, through hearing the stories from those who were on the cutting edge of that effort in northern Afghanistan early on. 5th Group Legionnaires and Night Stalkers of the 160th. Incredibly powerful panel from Team Sergeant from one of the Special Forces ODAs through the group commander at the time. So folks who are talking to Afghan partners, to the commander who's talking and getting guidance from the SecDef every single day. And then door gunners on the Blackhawks, the Special Blackhawks that went in through the commander of the battalion that led, the 160th aviation effort in the northern mountains of Afghanistan as well. So those sorts of things are what we want to do for the long term. But most important to us right now is building this building, and we've got it underway. We've poured the foundation, over 600 yards of concrete. We could have, I say tongue in cheek, 42 games of simultaneous pickleball on this foundation slab right now. It's huge. It's the exhibit hall, the entranceway, and then we're going to have an atrium. So the exhibit hall will be about 40,000 square feet. It'll talk a chronology of the history of all the units and then warfighting functions. So it'll talk engineering in World War II and contemporary military police, support, communications, things of that nature. And then we'll have a great entranceway. That'll be the handshake to the public and all who are visiting. And then the nice atrium that you see, that glass portion, will be in public event space, education, event venue, things like promotions, things like retirements, things of that nature. I predict we'll have a wedding in that bad boy within the first 6 months. So
yeah, you're talking about the military applications.
Right.
I'm over here like, can our daughters get married there someday? What are all the options? Yeah. I love how you talk about your family and how involved your wife is in your mission and how you always knew, and now your boys are serving in the Army. Every military family I know talks with such passion and courage about what it means to be a military family. But in the U.S. right now, recruitment is down. Not as many people are enlisting. Where do you think is this disconnect between your experience and the experience I see of other military families and what's being communicated to young people today?
That's a great point, and a strategic challenge for not just the Army, but all the armed forces. Young people, folks that directly influence them, immediate family members, et cetera, it's pretty rare to have an immediate family member. So for a high school age kid right now, they probably don't have an immediate family member that served because, again, 2 generations prior, the draft stopped. It wasn't compulsory. So folks generally serve for longer periods of time, but there's less total number of people who did serve. So they're missing, that fundamental storytelling, mentorship, sharing of experiences from aunts, uncles, et cetera, that served. And it's just, again, since selective service went away, you see the same people generally staying in for much longer and going on, more deployments, et cetera. The kids of soldiers that join the military, it is disproportionately higher than their classmates in any given school system or whatever. I think I'm certain it's because they see it, they live it, they know, the military is a values-based organization. It's filled with people of character, filled with people who have made this extreme commitment of serving in the forces which protect our country and our way of life, knowing they may give their life in that defense. That's complete commitment to something that's incredibly important to your nation. So I think military kids just see that, they're exposed to it, and they're drawn to it. And it shouldn't be that much of a surprise. A lot of lawyers' kids become lawyers. A lot of, pick a profession. The kids understand it, and they have some insights, and they have some mentorship along that line. So they may be drawn to it. But my son and daughter both wanted to serve early on, to give back before they take from this nation. And, I'm just super proud of them. And they're both serving today and thriving.
Tell me about the importance of ROTC programs. For our audience, we were talking a little bit about Austin Peay has a really robust ROTC program. I know that Vanderbilt does. Tell me the power of that.
Yeah. So officers earn their commission through really three ways. The service academies, so for the Navy, Annapolis, the Naval Academy in Maryland, for the Army, West Point, and then for the Marine Corps, they're also in Annapolis, and then the Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs, and the Coast Guard has an academy as well. So that's a 4-year committed. They're there full time. Then they commission for the Army about 1,000 lieutenants a year. ROTC commissions about 4,500 to 5,000 a year. There's ROTCs all across the United States, and I was commissioned through ROTC, as was my daughter. She went to LSU, and I went to Wisconsin, Milwaukee. So ROTCs are generally about a couple hundred cadets in all 4 years. Austin Peay is a little bit bigger because you get a lot of soldiers that separate from the Army, stay in Clarksville because it's such an awesome place to live and raise a family, et cetera, and then go to school at Austin Peay and enroll in the ROTC program there. So for the size of the university, Austin Peay has an exponentially larger ROTC detachment than most places do. So ROTC is important. Again, about 4,500 or so are commissioned, and largely they serve in the Army Reserve, the Army National Guard, but a fair amount in the regular Army as well. And it's an important source of leaders for all three components of the Army, and it produces the most lieutenants. Then there are some fairly unique commissioning avenues for medical doctors, et cetera. They can have a direct commissioning program. And then there's an officer candidate school where a certain number, it's generally about 1,000 a year, that are serving in the ranks are selected for this, and they go to an officer training program over the course of a few months and then earn their commission that way in a much more quick approach compared to ROTC, which is typically a 4-year, or service academy, which is 4 years as well.
Spence and I just were in Colorado for work, and we took our kids and we toured the Air Force Academy. And our oldest daughter saw it, and she immediately said, I think it would be really hard to be there for your first year, but by the end, it looks like you get to be in charge of everybody else. And that looks really cool. And I just was thinking what a gift it was that she could see this type of education and see another path for her leadership skills. Because obviously neither Spencer nor I have served our country in that way. So how, for those of us that are trying to raise children and to make them see this as a viable career path, what else should we be doing?
Well, when we're done, visit the Tennessee Wings of Liberty Museum.
There you go.
Because,
that was a good add-in.
Things like that will open some apertures, and then I would seek out and find, if there's an interest in one of the service academies or one of the branches of service, find somebody in your family, extended family, that served in the Air Force, and just share and talk about his or her service in the Air Force and what it meant to them and whatnot. My son went to West Point. My daughter went to LSU, ROTC, as did her husband. And she said early on, I want to be an Army officer, but I want to have fun as a student. And
she had priorities.
Right. Yeah. And she did great. But the service academy, it's a different environment. So if they're interested in that, they're going to want to talk to someone who went through that experience, because it is pretty unique. It's a complete commitment for 4 years. But as you said early on, there's a premium placed. It's very rigorous academically, but there's a premium placed on cadet leadership. They run everything, and they're responsible for the day-to-day operations and training events and things of that nature, in addition to their academic requirements. So it really prepares them for what awaits them as a lieutenant, but it is something that they want to talk to somebody that they know and trust to kind of gain some insights before moving on a path of commitment to something like that.
What would you say to the mamas out there, to the parents that, okay, we're so proud of our kid, they're making this choice, they want to serve our nation,
right?
But inevitably there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with sending your child into the armed forces. What would you say to a parent?
Yeah. The Armed Forces is an incredibly professional organization. Before we send troops or any organizations into harm's way, we're absolutely 101% certifying and training them, ensuring they have the best possible equipment, ensuring they're prepared for what awaits them to whatever mission or contingency that they're going to be placed against. There's always going to be a premium on leadership. There's always an opportunity to gain additional responsibility and additional leadership opportunities during the course of your time in the military, whatever that may be. Again, and now my perspective now is father of a couple and father-in-law to a few soldiers here, and they've deployed since they've been commissioned to Afghanistan and other areas. All of them have, and there's obvious apprehension as a parent, knowing that your children are going into harm's way. But I have the benefit of some insight as to what they did to prepare for it and how prepared they are for it, and I sit here with absolute confidence, again, with a couple of them deployed right now, that they're trained and prepared and absolutely ready for anything that awaits them based on the mission they've been given and what they're doing.
Well, I've got a playful question for you.
Sure.
So as we think about museums, you would be a pretty intimidating guy to go along to any museum along with, because some people consume museums where they read every little bit and they go through it and they know it, and you can't get anything past them because they know it. And other people are through a museum really quickly. Like Harley and I have that experience as we go through different ones, is that I think everyone in a relationship, there's one person that does read every placard and one person that's like, hey, I'm just like going to do a dot around here and there.
And then they marry each other and fight in every museum henceforth. Just kidding.
So it's a two-part question. One, what do your kids think about their dad being a museum guy? They're like, oh, Dad, I always knew that he was going to do something like this. Or is this kind of a little bit out of left field for them?
No, that's definitely, they knew this would be a natural line of drift for me. When I retired, I do some other things as well. This opportunity didn't really surface until, shortly after I retired. And Lieutenant General Mike Oates, who spent a lot of time at Fort Campbell as well, he and Pete Kinney, the chairman of our board, a guy named Scott Brower, who was former commander of 5th Special Forces Group, they really spearheaded the effort and harnessed Curtis Johnson, our representative down in Clarksville there, to get this state grant in the works. And that's what really made this possible. Had it not been for that, we probably would be at a position where, hey, the museum is what it is. We have what we have. Let's do what we can to improve the museum on post. But that might have been the end of it. Now, again, it's been coming soon for so long. What's really helping now is people are able to physically see that foundation's in, that the walls are going up before Thanksgiving, that the roof will be on it by Christmas, and the inside work will happen, and we'll start really filling it with these artifacts and stuff, in the fall timeframe of next year. So that's helped us with a couple of very significant benefactors just in the last couple months, get us over the finish line to pay for everything that you see on that depiction, the exhibit hall, the entrance, and the atrium. So, but yeah, the kids saw it coming. They knew, and you are right. There are some types of folks that visit museums, and inevitably it's somebody that's drawn immediately to the signature display in there, which in our case is going to be a very special MH-47 Chinook helicopter, a 160, a Special Ops Aviation variant of that, and that'll be an indoor exhibit at the very end. And that's where we're gonna start with the interactive and the tech stuff, where people will be able to go inside that helicopter, hear the sounds of the machine guns firing, hear the radio calls being made if it's inserting a platoon of Rangers, hear and smell and feel and see what it's like to be in one of those helicopters on a mission in eastern Afghanistan or pick your location. And then that particular aircraft has a very special history in terms of its serving with the 160th in every chapter of their history. So really excited about that. So some folks will see that immediately and get drawn to it. But we have a whole bunch of other really cool stuff that, again, tells the history of all these units, really starting with World War II. These are all relatively young units, no history before World War II. So right off the bat, you're going to see this D-Day exhibit with a Waco glider, one of only a few left in the world, the old glider that they would tow behind a cargo plane to bring in heavier equipment and soldiers and stuff like that. And then this Sherman tank linking up with the paratroopers on Utah Beach and them guiding them in to continue the assault on the Germans, to a Korean War exhibit, to a Vietnam artillery crew fire base exhibit to a Cold War exhibit that kind of shows some unique things about Fort Campbell. What we really want to expand also are the contemporary exhibits covering the contemporary conflict in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. So I think it'll scratch the itch of every type of museum goer. And again, it's free. It always will be. So if you do one speed round and you check out just the highlights and then mark your calendar, because it'll be one of those museums where you leave, man, I wish I could have spent another day in there. Well, spend another day in there, come back the following weekend and finish it up. For the long term, we're also going to have some outdoor exhibits, aircraft. We have to kind of restore them and move them and stuff as part of that. That'll be a little longer term objective, but it'll, like I said, 35-acre thing. It'll be great green space to just, family walk or run or, just do, if there's a class visit, a storybook trail kind of scavenger hunt thing and things of that nature.
I can imagine, as someone that's gone through different construction in our own business, when you're in the middle of building something and trying to dream something to life, all of a sudden, everything in the world around you, you start noticing, ooh, I'd like to do that. I'd like to do that. And we should incorporate this. So you may or may not in your role have a ton of influence over the direction of the museum, but you might. So have you gone and toured a lot of museums?
Absolutely.
Okay, so maybe tell us a couple that have stood out.
Sounds like we had to twist your arm to go look at all those other military museums. Shucks, man.
One great thing about most of the ones that were built in the last decade, even 5 years or so, is they are public-facing museums. So like us, they're not buried in an installation where it's a gauntlet to get to them. They're on the periphery generally, and they're immediately accessible to the public. The National Museum of the U.S. Army just opened a couple of years back, and that's at Fort Belvoir in Northern Virginia. So right in the D.C. area, this is the museum of the United States Army, 1775 to present.
Wow.
So that's your definitive collection and storyline of the history of the Army, and I'd really encourage you to check it out. It's an awesome experience. Another free museum, world-class Smithsonian-like, just facility that tells the story of the U.S. Army. So super proud of that. At Fort Cavazos, formerly Fort Hood, they just opened a museum like ours that really showcases the mounted war tanks and mechanized warfare, and it's a lot of vehicle displays, and the storyline talks about the evolution of all that and whatnot. That's a very similar one. There's one at Fort Moore, formerly Fort Benning, Georgia, which is another must-see. It's right off post again, easily accessible, and it's the museum of the infantry, the history of the infantry, again from 1775 to present. So where our museum doesn't really address much earlier than World War II. Here you have incredible displays of trench warfare in World War I, and the plains wars in the 19th century, things like that. So there's a lot of museums that have just kind of gotten to the point where we are soon to open. And ours will really tell the story of fighting from the sky, vertical envelopment, parachute assault, helicopter assault, the aviation there at Fort Campbell with the 101st and the 160th, and all that 5th Group does, generally fight from the sky in some form or another. And that's really the storyline behind our museum.
I can't believe you waited this long to ask the drone question.
Yep.
Where do we see the drones that I know that are...
Well, like in the intelligence warfighting function display, it'll be an intelligence analyst watching the image projected from a drone with the drone hanging from the ceiling of the building.
Will that be in our museum?
Absolutely,
okay. Ours, like as if I am part of this, our Tennessee museum?
It is our museum. Yes, absolutely.
I love that you're showcasing everything from World War II to now, because there has been so much innovation. But gosh, as we've traveled, we've been to D.C. and all over the place, seeing how long and hardy these aircrafts are too, and how many different deployments they can do. I mean, I love new technology, but it's pretty incredible how our military builds things to last and how we are stewards of them. My daughter and son-in-law fly aircraft older than them every single day. That MH-47 in there, goes back to the 1960s, the 60s, early 70s, the twilight of the Vietnam era. Heavily modified since, and a lot of innovation and technology applied to it since, but it's still the same basic airframe. I mean, a lot of those are just
timeless, classic building blocks that these innovative soldiers and units have modified to meet some very unique mission profile specifics.
That's good stewardship.
Yeah.
Carly and I have had the opportunity to interview a number of different nonprofits and foundations, and sometimes the benefactors of who that is going to resonate with is pretty obvious based upon their mission. And in some way, I could kind of say, all right, if I had to guess who some major benefactors might be, I might be able to guess, but I could be totally wrong. So maybe just talk for a second, because I know fundraising is a big part of what still has to happen to bring this thing to life. So maybe you can just talk for a minute about someone that maybe has never even thought about giving to something like this, why they should, and then maybe just a little bit of a picture of some of your benefactors, why they decided to make this a meaningful part of their legacy.
We wouldn't be here if it weren't for some significant grants from the state, the county, the city, and then a federal grant that goes back to about the 2008 timeframe. Those were significant multi-million-dollar grants that made the construction possible. To start construction, we had to have, since we're gifting this to the Army, we had to have the total cost of the construction in our pockets, ready to go. To avoid the obvious issue, well-intended foundation, hey, let's get started with the building. We don't have enough, but the fundraising will come. And all of a sudden you got a half-built museum, the fundraising dies, and it just becomes a white elephant kind of thing. So we had to get the resources to build the museum. And then we had to prioritize some things. We knew the rough size that it had to be to house what we wanted it to house. We kept our eye on the focus, which is the content, storyline, and the experience in the museum is the most important thing. So we had a couple rheostats. One was cost and fundraising, and then the other was adjust the design to meet the parameters of what we have. And we did a little bit of both. We kind of scaled it a little bit. We kind of refined the design a little bit to take advantage of some new construction techniques and whatnot that didn't necessarily exist when the first design was built, and just took a fresh look at it. And then we have a great team helping us with this. Commonwealth Development Group built the big F&M arena and Ford Ice Center there in Clarksville. They just did that and did it during COVID, under budget, ahead of schedule. So great team.
I like those phrases.
Yeah, exactly.
Under budget, ahead of schedule.
Knock on wood, we're still there with this. They're doing a great job, and they assembled the right team. And even the subcontractors and the general contractor, Bart Mallow, and the subcontractors gave us very favorable gifts, very favorable bids on this thing. In some cases, almost a gift in kind of deal. So we know that what's depicted on this schematic here, we know this is going to happen, and we're going to have it. The atrium, the entrance, and the 40,000 square foot exhibit hall. We're going to have that. At the end of next summer, early fall, ready to get the exhibits in and bring it to life. So that's a good place to be. We knew we couldn't start until it was assured that we'd finish it. And then the Army pre-accepted it essentially, but it went all the way to the Secretary of the Army level of approval. But fundraising continues. Like I said, we got this awesome house we're gonna cut the ribbon on here in really 7-8 months or so. But the furniture we bought 20 years ago, some assembly required, some modification required, and then we want to cover those new chapters and more coverage of 5th Special Forces and the 160th. So that's a huge fundraising effort, and a single benefactor in Clarksville, a pillar of the community, a wonderful gentleman who has helped us in terms of his generosity and his support of this over the decades. He and his families just made a commitment, a multi-million-dollar commitment to kind of get us over the finish line with bringing that Chinook exhibit to life and making it an experience, not just an exhibit, and then starting, get the nucleus of some of the interactive and tech stuff going. And then as we raise more money, we'll just grow that tech and interactive piece more and more. As I also mentioned, again, fundraising will be in perpetuity because it's kind of like anything. You're always improving your position. You build a new house, you're already thinking the first remodel, down the road. We want to add, not remodel, but we want to add that outdoor exhibit space. We want to add an outdoor space where you could have ceremonial events, retirements, promotions, things like that. We got a plan, but we want to expand the memorial bricks things where families typically buy bricks that have the rank and name of their loved one, and we put those those in, and units will buy them with their icon as a fundraising mechanism and as a rally point. So, a family comes, let's find, grandma's brick or Aunt Barbara's brick or whoever it might be, or a unit comes for a reunion and they see their icon there and they know it's going to be there in that campus of awesome history forever. So long term, there's some big things we still want to do, but our focus right now is just getting this thing open. I think that ribbon cutting was a seminal event in June because it was a no kidding. I'm sorry, I said ribbon cutting groundbreaking in June because it was a no kidding groundbreaking. I mean, we turned some dirt with some ceremonial entrenching tools and shovels, but we had bulldozers scraping out the foundation bed the very next day. So people are seeing that. People know it's actually happening, and that in turn has helped quite a bit with gentlemen like the one benefactor I talked about, and several others as well that are making significant commitments to, put their name on that and see it to fruition with the way we want it to be.
Love that.
I think it's just a really special thing to see your heart coming, really your whole life story in a way of giving back that has been your entire life's narrative. I mean, you have served your country in a way that is not only generational, both older than you and younger than you, but to come and tell this story for the state of Tennessee and something that we're really, really lucky to have Fort Campbell here and the economic impact and the cultural impact that it has upon our state is cool. And I tell you one other thing, General, that I appreciate about what you've done here is you have approached this build very entrepreneurially. And I don't know if that is or isn't a feature of the Army. I probably could make an argument that it might not be as much as anything because there's a lot of process and procedure that keeps everybody safe. But here, you've had to be very scrappy. And you've had to build before you have all the money for the whole vision. You've been able to take something that has sat dormant for, it sounds like decades, and bring it to life. And I think that leadership makes it very clear why you've had the career that you've had in serving this country. So we're excited to be able to get behind this and push and bring awareness to what you're really doing. And kudos for having it be just off base too, because I think you're right. For people that don't have a military background, it's super intimidating to go on base. I mean, you're like, I don't think I have anything in my record, but I
don't
really
want to find out here. Right.
There could have been a ticket or, I'm going to. So in any case, we're really excited to see it come to fruition. And thank you so much for telling us about this.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Today we have Major General Brian Winski, President and CEO of the Fort Campbell Historical Foundation. That was a really fun conversation from a really impressive human being.
I can't believe we got to do that. Honestly, his story about his family for generations being in military service, I was blown away.
I was partly worried that he was going to show up here in full uniform, like with all of it.
Me
and
too.
I would just be so intimidated that I'd be like, all right, I'm going to have to take this 7 times before I can get this intro right because I can't mess this up.
No, you can't. I was sitting in my closet this morning like, what does one wear on a podcast with a major general?
A couple takeaways that I have is one, to serve for 37 years like he has, and then to be able to come out and do something so entrepreneurial that there isn't a handbook for how to create a museum and how to do it on a shoestring budget and how to fundraise. He's got a really diverse skill set that had he taken a different path and been a business leader, he would have been phenomenal in that space. So it's part of, I think, just the principles of leadership that it served him extraordinarily well in serving our nation, thank goodness. And it's serving him really well in the next chapter of his life in giving back. But it's just as fascinating to see him step into the room, and the leadership that you feel off of him is just immediate.
He definitely has a presence.
Yes.
Yeah. And his almost photographic memory of everything to do with Fort Campbell and all of the regiments and the people that have served, I just have left talking to him with such gratitude for our state and what we do for the nation as a whole. And it really left me thinking about what makes Tennessee special. And Fort Campbell is a huge part of that, the value that it puts into our entire state of what it means to be a military family, what it means to sacrifice, what it means to put others above yourself. I mean, I think that permeates our whole culture.
Something else that I took away is that our military takes on a lot of heat and a lot of damage for a lot of stuff. They're accused of being wasteful, at times incompetent, woke, a number of different things right now. And sitting across from him, I had not only none of those things, but a true rejection of that to say when men like him have been in charge and are still just a little bit removed from being in charge, none of those things have taken deep root inside of our military. Clearly, the organization, like every organization, will have things that have to be worked on and improved and budget challenges. But I really did feel a pride for Tennessee, pride for our country, and concern over some of the numbers that he's talking about, that it's been well publicized for a couple decades that we're seeing real drops in the number of people that are serving, that feel compelled to serve. And so I think he's bringing an interesting message to say, let me teach you via a narrative. Let me show you these stories. And I think he phrased it, open a new aperture for how people think about serving your country. And I could really see that be successful, especially on the doorstep of Fort Campbell itself, to say, here's history, but here's where you can make it a reality for you or your family.